The voicemail came in at 6:47 on a Thursday morning. I was already up. I'd been waking at 5:30 since my wife passed, 4 years ago now. Something about the silence in the house after that, it just stops letting you sleep. I had my coffee. I was standing at the kitchen window watching the snow come down on the backyard, the way it covers everything so clean and quiet. And then my phone buzzed on the counter. It was my son's wife. Not my son, his wife. I almost didn't listen to it right away. My daughter-in-law and I had never been close. She was polite the way a hotel receptionist is polite, technically warm, fundamentally indifferent. I'd learned to accept that. Some people don't open up to family they married into, and I'd told myself that was fine. My son loved her. That was enough. But something made me press play right there at the window with the snow still falling. "I just wanted to let you know," her voice said. "No hello, no good morning, that the property taxes on the cottage are 3 months overdue. We got a notice. It would be good if you handled that soon." That was the whole message. I set the phone down, picked up my coffee, looked at the snow. The cottage she was referring to was a property I'd bought in Muskoka in 1987. I'd spent 30 years fixing it up, replacing the dock twice, refinishing every floor myself by hand. My late wife had loved that place more than anywhere else on earth. We'd brought our son there every summer from the time he was 3 years old. When she died, I'd started to think about what to do with it. My son was the obvious answer. I'd told him at some point that it would be his one day. His wife had apparently taken that to mean it was already hers. Here's what I want you to understand before I go any further. I am not a hard man. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer with the province of Ontario. I am the kind of person who brings muffins to the office on Fridays and remembers the names of people's children. After my wife got sick, I was the one who drove her to every appointment. Barrie, Toronto, twice to Ottawa, without being asked and without complaining. I was raised to be steady, and I have been steady my whole life. But there is a version of steady that looks, from the outside, like a door that never closes. My son had walked through that door his entire adult life. He was 34 when this all happened. He had never held a job for more than 2 years. Not because he couldn't find work. He had a degree in business administration from Western, which I paid for, and enough charm to walk into almost any room and be liked. But something always went wrong. The boss was unreasonable. The company had a toxic culture. The hours weren't sustainable. There was always a reason, and the reasons were always just plausible enough that I never felt I could push back. So I helped. That's what fathers do, I told myself. I helped with his rent when he first moved to Toronto, then with his car payments when the lease came due, then with the deposit on a new apartment when he and his wife moved to a larger place in the annex, then with what he called a bridge loan between jobs that had lasted, at the time of the voicemail, going on 14 months. I want to be honest about the numbers because I think that's part of the story. Over 5 years, I had given my son somewhere between $80,000 and $90,000, not lent, given. There were no promissory notes, no repayment schedules, just transfers from my account to his, usually preceded by a phone call where he explained the situation. I listened and said I'd see what I could do, and then I did it. My daughter didn't know the full scope of it. She's younger than my son by 3 years, lives in Calgary now with her husband and their 2 kids. She'd worked her way through school on scholarships and part-time jobs, bought her first condo at 28 with a down payment she'd saved herself. I admired her for it. I also knew, in a quiet way I never said out loud, that the money I kept sending east was partly money that should have been treated equally. That thought had been getting louder for about a year. But it was the voicemail that cracked something open. Not because the message itself was catastrophic. The cottage property taxes were, in fact, overdue. I'd been distracted that fall, dealing with a health scare of my own that turned out to be nothing but had taken up several months of my attention. It was an oversight. I would have caught it. What cracked something open was the tone, the assumption, the complete absence of "I hope you're well" or "how are you feeling." I had told my son about the health scare, and he had told his wife just the flat expectation that I would handle it, that I was a resource to be managed. I called my son that afternoon. He answered on the third ring. I could hear his wife in the background. Hey, Dad, what's up? I got a message this morning, I said, about the cottage taxes. Yeah, we got that notice and figured we should let you know. I paused. She called it the cottage, not my cottage. She said it would be good if I handled it. A short silence. I mean, you do own it. I do, I said. I do own it. Another pause. Then he said, Dad, is this going somewhere? I've got a call in 20 minutes. Something shifted in me then. Not anger. It wasn't anger. It was more like the moment when you've been pushing a stalled car and you finally just stop pushing and step back and look at it. I said, no, it's not going anywhere. We'll talk soon. I hung up. I sat in my living room in Bury for a long time after that. The house was very quiet. The snow had stopped. I looked at the framed photo on the mantel. My wife and I at the cottage, 1993. My son about 3 years old standing between us in rubber boots, laughing at something off camera. She had a hand on my arm. She was always doing that, just resting her hand on my arm. I thought about what she would say if she could see the way things had gone. I thought I knew the answer. She'd been softer than me in some ways and harder in others. She would not have liked this. She would have said something long before it got to this point. She had always been better at saying the hard thing than I was. 2 days later, I called my accountant, and then I called my lawyer. Not to do anything drastic, just to understand where I stood. My accountant is a woman I've worked with for 15 years. She pulled up my records, and we went through everything quietly and professionally. When we were done, she didn't offer an opinion, but she looked at the total, and then she looked at me, and she said, "You've been generous." My lawyer, who I've known even longer, was more direct. He said the cottage is in your name. Everything you've transferred was a gift, legally speaking, with no documentation of any expectation of repayment. You're under no obligation whatsoever. He paused. But more importantly, you're 63 years old, and you had a health scare this fall, and you should be thinking about what you actually want to do with what you've built. He was right. I knew he was right. That night, I called my daughter. I hadn't told her much about the financial situation with her brother over the years. I hadn't wanted her to feel it was unfair, and I hadn't wanted to speak badly about her brother to her. But she was my family too, and I was tired of carrying things alone. She listened for a long time without interrupting. That's how she's always been, patient, thoughtful. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, I kind of knew, not the numbers, but I knew." She didn't say anything bitter or accusatory about her brother. She just said, "What do you want to do?" That question. I hadn't been asked that question in a long time. I said I wasn't sure yet, but I was starting to figure it out. What I did first was the property taxes on the cottage. I paid them, they were mine to pay, and I paid them. But while I was doing that, I also had my lawyer look at the formal documentation around the property. There was nothing in writing that had ever promised it to my son. There was no will provision, no letter, nothing. That was only a conversation I'd had years ago where I'd said, loosely, "This will be yours someday." Loosely. I had that conversation informally with my son the following week. I called him on a Sunday afternoon. His wife answered. They shared an account linked to his number, which I'd always found slightly odd, and said he was busy. Could I call back? I said I'd try later. She said, "Is it about the cottage?" Because we've actually been doing some research on the property values up there, and there are some things we'd want to talk about. I held the phone very still. I said, "What kind of things?" And she said quite casually, "Well, if you were thinking of signing it over, we'd want to look at the tax implications. We have some ideas about what we might do with it." "What you might do with it," I said. "I mean, it needs a lot of work. The dock is old. We probably want to update the interior." A pause. "It could actually be quite valuable as a rental property in the summer months. We've looked at some numbers." I thanked her and hung up. I sat in the car. I had taken the call in the driveway, I remember, and I looked at the steering wheel for a while. Rental property, summer months. My wife had planted perennials along the path to the water. She went back every spring to see if they'd come up again. She had a chair on the dock where she used to read on Sunday mornings while the mist was still on the lake. She had died in the fall, and her ashes were scattered at that property at the edge of the water because that's what she asked for. And my daughter-in-law had looked at some numbers. I didn't call my son back that week, or the week after. What I did instead was tell my lawyer to move forward with updating my will, not to punish anyone, not out of anger, out of clarity. I was 63 years old and I'd had a health scare, and I had spent a long time not asking what I wanted. It was time to ask. I left the cottage to my daughter. I set up a modest trust that would provide my son with a fixed amount per year, enough to help, not enough to float a lifestyle indefinitely, with the provision that the annual amount would increase if he maintained verifiable employment for 12 consecutive months. My lawyer said that kind of structure was unusual but not unheard of. He said some families found it helpful to have those expectations explicit. I also stopped the monthly transfers, not dramatically. I didn't make an announcement. When my son called the following month, he called on the 15th, which was when I usually transferred funds, and asked if I'd had a chance to send anything over because they were a bit tight. I said no. He said, "What?" I said, "I'm not going to be doing that anymore. Not the monthly transfers." Silence. "Dad, what are you talking about? We're counting on that." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." He raised his voice a little. Said I was being dramatic. Said he and his wife had been going through a hard time and this wasn't the moment. Said he didn't understand where this was coming from. I said I'd been sending you money every month for 5 years. Before that there were other things. I've never asked for anything back and I'm not asking now. But I'm 63 and I had a health scare this fall that you asked about once and didn't bring up again. And I need to make sure I'm taken care of too. He was quiet. "I love you," I said. "I'll always help if there's a real emergency, but I can't keep being the answer to every tight month. It's not good for you, and it's not good for me." He hung up. He didn't call back for 11 days. When he did, his wife was not in the background. His voice was different, quieter, slower. He said he'd been thinking. He said some things that surprised me, that he'd known for a while that the situation wasn't sustainable, that he'd been meaning to make some changes. He didn't apologize exactly, but there was something underneath his words that felt like the beginning of one. We talked for almost an hour. I'm not going to tell you it was fixed in that phone call, because it wasn't. Things that have calcified over years don't dissolve in an hour. But it was a real conversation, maybe the first one we'd had in a long time, where I wasn't managing the distance between us by filling it with money. He got a job 2 months later, project coordinator as a logistics firm in Mississauga. Steady, not glamorous, the kind of job he would have dismissed 5 years ago as beneath him. He's been there for 7 months now. His wife and I are still not close. I don't expect that to change. But she's been careful with me in a way she wasn't before, and I've been civil. And for now, that's what there is. The cottage is still standing. I went up in September, first time since the previous summer. I walked down the path to the water. The perennials my wife planted had come up again, the way they always do, stubborn and bright, right where she put them. I sat in her chair on the dock and watched the light move on the lake for a long time. She would have sorted all of this out years ago, I think. She was better at the hard conversations than I was, but I got there. Eventually, I got there. And sitting on that dock in September, with the water flat and silver and the trees just starting to turn, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, more like ballast. The feeling of weight distributed properly. The feeling of a boat that will not tip. I started the drive home in the late afternoon, the light already going golden the way it does in fall up north. The highway back to Barrie was quiet. I had the window down a little. The air smelled like pine and cold water and a particular kind of October that makes you glad, in spite of everything, that you live somewhere with seasons. I thought about calling my daughter. I thought I would when I got home. I thought, this is still a good life. That is still a mine. I keep coming back to the perennials. My wife planted them along the path to the water the summer we bought the cottage. Nothing fancy, just some coneflowers and black-eyed Susans she picked up at a nursery in Gravenhurst. She wasn't even sure they'd take, but they came back every spring without being asked, without being watered or tended or coaxed. They just came back because that's what something well-rooted does. I think about that when I think about what went wrong with my son and what I had to do with my own part in it. The truth is, I didn't just enable him financially, I enabled something in his character that should have been gently corrected years before it became a crisis. Every time I transferred money without question, I was quietly telling him that the world would absorb his choices without consequence. That's not love. That's a kind of cowardice dressed up as generosity. I didn't want the discomfort of saying no, and so I kept saying yes, and the yes accumulated into something neither of us could see clearly until it was already a structure we were both living inside. What I've come to understand is that genuine care for another person, real care, not the kind that feels good in the moment, requires a certain kind of moral clarity. You have to be honest about what someone actually needs, not just what they're asking for. My son didn't need another transfer. He needed someone to believe he was capable of standing on his own and to hold that belief firmly enough to act on it. I failed to do that for a long time. I mistook comfort for kindness and called it fatherhood. There's also something to be said for what I did eventually when I finally did it, which was think carefully before I acted. I didn't cut him off in anger. I called my accountant. I called my lawyer. I sat with the question for weeks. I wanted to be fair, and I wanted to be clear-headed, not reactive. That matters. Decisions made from hurt tend to create more hurt. Decisions made from honest thinking tend to hold. And then there is the harder thing, which is that I had to find the steadiness to actually follow through, to say what I meant, and not walk it back when he pushed. That's not easy when you love someone. It might be one of the harder things there is, but I've learned that the willingness to hold a difficult position, to stay steady when someone you care about is upset with you, is not coldness. It's a form of respect. It says, I believe you can handle the truth. I believe you can do better. My son has been employed for 7 months now. He calls more often than he used to, and the calls are different. We talk like two people who are actually present with each other, not like a creditor and a borrower running through a transaction. I don't know how the rest of it unfolds, but I know how I want to live the time I have left, with my eyes open, my accounts in order, and the cottage going to the person who will love it the way it deserves to be loved. The perennials will come back in the spring. They always do.